Today's video does contain some stories with disturbing subject matter, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a story you would like to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so, and as always, I appreciate you. I've worked at a small gas station in what I consider a middle-of-nowhere town for quite a few years now. I used to work the day shift, but I decided that I would take the pay increase and lose my social life and work the overnight shift instead. Not like I had much of a social life to lose, but to be honest, I've been married for about 10 years now, and we don't exactly go out to parties or hang out with our friends or anything. Thankfully, my wife doesn't mind that I work the overnight shift, and we've made it work between the two of us. Honestly, the job has been incredibly uneventful for the years that I've worked it, with very little exception. Obviously, this is an event that is an exception. One important thing to note about this station is that we are, mostly, a 24/7 station, with a 1-hour exception each night for us to count down the drawer and do the receipt drop in the back. Basically, we close the store for 1 hour to mark the end of the business day for the business and pull the numbers. They used to not close to do it, but there was one point where the store was actually robbed by a former employee during the count because he knew the time that it was done, and the door was unlocked, so he took advantage of it. Ever since then, they've made it to where the store is closed for 1 hour every night. It's a weird system, but it does work in the end. On this night, I had closed down the store at 3 a.m. as I was scheduled to do, and I had counted down the drawer first and then did the receipt print for the card transactions. I had actually gotten it down to about 40 minutes, so I had 20 minutes until I needed to reopen, and I decided that I would go ahead and just take a few moments to myself behind the counter. Kind of like a power nap sort of thing. Not really sleeping, but just dozing off for the full 20 minutes. A couple seconds after I had sat and closed my eyes, I started hearing what sounded like a banging noise. It was enough to pull me from my light nap and make me jump. I looked around at the doors, and there was a woman that was smacking one of the doors and pulling on it as hard as she could. At first, I instinctively started saying, "We're closed until 4. I can't unlock the door until then." But as I started talking, I could tell by the way that she was frantically pulling at the door and staring at me that something was seriously wrong. Since I'd already counted down the drawer, I figured that I could let her in and at least see what the hell was going on. I walked around the counter and unlocked the door and asked what I could help her with. She told me that her car had broken down a few blocks down the road, and that she was trying to get here so that she could have someone pick her up, since she wasn't from around the area. But then said that for the last block or two, there was somebody that was following her. Now, this was definitely a creepy story, but I was a bit skeptical at first. It almost felt like one of those stories that you would tell to scam someone, or to get them to let their guard down. I actually asked her what she wanted me to do about it, and she said that she just wanted to come inside to call her husband so that he could come and get her. After a few moments of her reiterating things, and me feeling like she was probably telling the truth, I decided to just let her in and lock the door. I told her that we weren't technically open, so I couldn't have her anywhere in the store other than right there. She said that she understood, and that she would stay at the front door, and apologized for the whole thing, saying that she didn't mean to be a bother. She was just really scared about what the guy that was following her was planning on doing. At this point, I felt like she was leaning too heavily into the story to actually be lying to me. So I told her that it wasn't a bother, and mentioned that if she sees him, that I would go ahead and call the cops for her. After a few moments of her talking on her phone to whom I'm assuming was her husband, and then her waiting and just staring out the front door, she started making a bit of small talk, which was fine. I still had a couple moments before I could reopen, so I kind of welcomed the conversation. No sooner than when we started just talking about whatever, I heard another loud sound. But this time, it wasn't just a person smacking the glass. It was the sound of something smashing the glass on the side door. Thankfully, the door was designed so that smashing it would not allow access, as the glass was reinforced, wasn't very wide, and there were 4 metal bars across it. But this guy was seriously doing everything he could to smash the glass so that he could get in. Like, he was pretty clear in what he was trying to do. The woman screamed. I kind of yelped like, "Whoa, what the hell?" and turned to look at the scene in front of me. After realizing what was happening, it occurred to me to hit the panic button. I know you're not supposed to hit them until the robber leaves in order to prevent a hostage situation, but I knew that he wasn't going to be able to get into the store with what he was doing. I'm sure that this whole thing played out in like 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. Just standing there, watching this guy rapidly smash the glass in the door and trying his hardest to get into the station. All the while, the woman is screaming that this is the guy that was following her. I'm yelling at her to get behind the counter and trying to figure out what the hell I could do. I guess the guy finally realized that he wasn't going to get in, and he just kind of stood there staring at the two of us with this horrible grin. Like, you could see the malice just pouring out of this dude, and he kept pointing at the two of us and shaking his head. It was terrifying. At no point did he say a word. He just stared, smiled, pointed, and shook his head back and forth, which honestly felt more threatening than if he had been screaming at us. Finally, I started hearing the sirens as the officers started to pull into the lot, and this guy took off behind the building and out of sight. A couple of officers took off after him, and another one came to the door to check on us. I went over and opened it, and, well, that was a fun time, explaining to him and the owner when he showed up what the hell had gone down. The woman explained her side, I told my side. It was pretty much the same story, honestly. She had no idea who this guy really was, and I obviously didn't know him. This was just some dude that was an absolute psycho and had ill intentions with this poor woman. The officers waited for her husband to show up to come and get her, and I ended up having a long night with them and the owner going over everything, and going through the footage on the cameras. The owner wasn't too happy that I let her in during our closed hour, but I straight told him that if I hadn't, this guy would have gotten to her, and that would have been a lot worse than a bit of property damage. Thankfully, this was the most eventful situation that I've ever had on this job, and I hope that it stays that way. I don't know if they ended up catching the guy or if he got away from them that night, but I never saw him after that, nor did I ever see her. I was definitely a bit nervous to go back the next day, but it was just normal operations after that. I did have to explain to a few of our regulars what happened to the door, which got old, but it is what it is. So, to that lady, I hope that you're doing okay and that this didn't traumatize you too much. And to that guy, I hope that you and I never meet again. You absolute psycho. I work the overnight shift at a gas station that is situated in a suburb area that isn't fully incorporated. By that, I mean that there aren't houses everywhere, and there are quite a few spots that are just dense forests. When you live and work near areas that are just trees like this, a lot of weird rumors and stories get thrown around, and this area was no exception. I had actually heard some dumb stories about the woods from coworkers. There was a rumor that they, whoever they were, had found a bunch of mutilated deers out in the woods, and that a man had once been camping in the woods and got attacked by something. I don't know why a man would be camping in the woods behind a neighborhood, but it is what it is. They were just silly stories told by people to scare others. Of course, now, I'm a bit more of a believer because of the fact that I saw something in those woods that I can't really explain. It was a pretty quiet night. We weren't very busy, so I was taking the opportunity to do some restocking and cleaning of some of the shelves. As I was stocking some of the chips, I heard what sounded like a thud coming from where the dumpster was on the side of the building. Unfortunately, we'd had issues with the homeless guy that kept trying to sleep in our dumpster. And as much as I felt bad for the guy, I couldn't let him do that, because the truck came for the dumpster at like 4 in the morning. So, if he was sleeping in it overnight, well, bad things could happen. I stepped outside to check it out and see if it was him, and if it was, to tell him that he couldn't stay there. As soon as I stepped outside, I got hit with something that I actually struggle to describe, beyond a hit of adrenaline that sent chills down my spine. It was like I needed to be scared of something, and my body knew that I needed to be scared, but I didn't know what I needed to be scared of. I slowly turned toward where the dumpster was, and I really don't know what it was that I was looking at. Whatever it was, it had dropped the dumpster onto its side, and it was tearing into the trash. I just sort of stood there staring at this nasty mass of fur that was eating the garbage. I think I was trying to place a name to this thing, and it was like some kind of dog, or like a wolf, or a coyote. But no, I can say with certainty that this thing was canine-like, but was not a normal canine. Its body was lanky, like its limbs were extended like a person's, and it was way too large to be any sort of dog. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. If I had to put a number to it, I would say that it could have easily stood 6 foot tall. Its fur was matted and dirty and dark, and I could see that this thing had hellish claws on its hands or paws or whatever. After a few minutes of me just standing there and watching this thing, it noticed me. It kind of just sniffed in my direction, but then ended up turning away and crawling back into the trees. I watched it as it went back into the forest, and just kind of stood there watching me as I watched it, though it was probably just waiting for me to leave. I was watching it because I was horrified. When I regained control of my legs, I ran back into the station and just stayed at the counter pretending that this whole event never even happened, because I didn't want to think about this possibility that that thing could be out there, lurking. I tried to rationalize what I saw numerous times, saying it was a wolf or just a really, really skinny bear. But I know for a fact that it wasn't. I don't know what it was, but I don't have a name for it, other than creepy, dog-looking, cryptid thing. I'm sure that someone else will probably say what they think it was, and I welcome that because any information would be helpful. I haven't seen it since that night, and I still work the same shift, but it hasn't come back, thankfully. Though, I will say that now, every time I hear something out by the back of the store messing with the dumpster, I tend to ignore it. I have a weird experience that I wanted to share that was just... I honestly don't know what words to use to describe it. It was creepy in its own right, and honestly, it left me feeling a bit shaken. Thankfully, I came out of the whole thing unscathed, but I kind of feel like it could have gone much, much worse. So, to start off, I'm a delivery driver for a restaurant that isn't the normal kind that does delivery. I'm the only driver for this specific restaurant, and while we aren't as busy as, say, pizza shops, we do get enough orders to keep me busy for an entire shift. Because of this, I put a good number of miles onto my car, and I drain my tank pretty frequently. Sometimes I have to stop at random stations along the way or in between deliveries to make sure that I have enough miles left to get to the next stop, or stops, and then back to home base. It takes a good amount of coordination, and I have honestly pushed it once or twice to a limit that I don't like to push it to. This was, unfortunately, one of those times. It was near closing time, and I was on the last 3 deliveries. It was a triple, so I had to take one, then the next, and then the next as quickly as I could. I had gotten the first one done, looked up the location for the next, and as soon as I did, I noticed that the mile counter on my car showed 3. Basically, I had 3 miles to go until I was on a hard empty. I wouldn't say that this is the most accurate reading, but again, I don't want to end up randomly stranded with 2 people's dinner sitting in my passenger seat. I hit the button for the nearest gas station, and sure enough, there was one that was between 1 mile and 2 miles from where I was sitting. It looked like it was kind of tucked in between a couple of neighborhoods. Like, this was a really weirdly placed station, but I was thankful that it was close. I pulled away, made the quick trip to the station, and sure enough, it was there. Google wasn't lying to me this time. The building was dark, like they'd closed up the shop for the night, but the pumps had card readers and were definitely still on based on the lights shining on the screens and overhead. I pulled into the parking lot, got up next to one of the pumps, got out and swiped my card. Basically did all the things that one does when they're going to fill their tank. After a couple of seconds, I noticed a couple of guys standing next to the building. One of them was sitting on the ground and smoking. I could see the embers glowing in the dark. And the other was staring at me from underneath his hood. Of course, I was a bit on edge. I did have cash on me from the deliveries, but at the same time, with where he was standing, I would have had time to throw the pump and jump into my car before he could even get close. So, assuming he didn't have a gun or anything, I was cautious, but pretty sure I would be safe. I go back to filling up, and as the amount hits 5 gallons, the pump just suddenly stops. I stare at it, squeeze it once or twice, but sure enough, it was done with me. I looked up at the machine and then towards the building, as if there was going to be someone there to help me, when I noticed that the man with the cigarette in his mouth was now standing at the emergency shutoff valve, which explained why the pump stopped working. Within the second that it took me to realize that it was just him, I heard footsteps behind me and thought, I really just let this happen. After telling myself that I was going to be fine and that I would have time to jump in my car, I'm seriously about to get robbed by this creep. I turned slightly and, as expected, the man with the hoodie on is approaching me. But strangely enough, he's not getting very close. Like he was walking towards me, but stopped about 6 or so feet from me. He lifts his head a bit to stare at me, and I look at him, and there were several awkward moments that we shared while standing at this gas station pump. The whole time I'm just thinking, I'm dead, while glancing between him and the man at the shutoff valve on the building, making sure that neither of them is getting closer or pulling a gun or something. I honestly have no idea why I did this, but I looked up at the man in the hoodie and just kind of shyly said, the pump isn't working. Like, this man worked there and was going to go troubleshoot my problems. I really don't know why I said it. I guess it was just me being scared and confused as to what was about to happen. The man smirks, looks down at me and then up at the machine and says, "Station's closed." As if I wasn't already being awkward and weird, I pointed toward the card reader and said something like, "Oh, but I should be able to still get gas, right? The readers are 24/7. The guy in the hoodie seriously started laughing. Like I had just told him the most hilarious joke and he could not hold it in. After shaking that off, he shook his head and looked back at me to say, "No, mate, the station is closed. No more gas. Hint, hint." And then motioned for me to get into my car and leave. I stood there for a moment, and thankfully my brain finally clicked that he was telling me to get the hell out of there. I nodded, replaced the pump, and told him to have a good evening and got back in my car. As I did, I looked in my rearview mirror and I watched this guy put his fingers up to his head and motion as if he was shooting himself and start laughing again as he waved at me. I obviously took off from there, and it took a few moments for me to really get a grip on the whole thing, but I think he was basically telling me that if I came back, I was dead. I made a note of where I was and, well, I left. Now, I'm not sure, but I think that his original plan was much more sinister than what he had ended up doing. And I think that my awkwardness may have actually saved me. Like, I made my dumb comment and it tickled him to the point that he felt bad, and he thought, "Oh, I can't kill this pitiful idiot." Obviously, I have no idea if that's true or if he was just willing to give me the opportunity to leave, and if I didn't, then he would take action. But I'm glad that he decided I wasn't worth his time. Thankfully, that 5 gallons was more than enough to get me to my destinations and back to the store to clock out. I made a mental note to never go back to that station, and I haven't, thankfully. If I have a delivery over in that direction, I fill up before I go that way, just in case. I know it's not the creepiest of stories, but it scared me, and like I said, I came out unscathed, but I feel like I was pretty close to something pretty terrible happening to me. Hello, Raven. I have a scary story of my own to tell, so here we go. So, for some background, I'm a 43-year-old male, and this happened to me about 3 years ago. My wife worked second shift as a nurse at a nursing home. At the time, we only had one car, so I would drive her to work and pick her up so I could use the car during the time that she was at work. One night, on the way to pick her up, I decided to stop at a gas station to grab a famous Circle K Polar Pop and a snack for both of us. Now, I need to explain the layout of the parking lot in the store. This was a small Circle K with a very small parking lot. On the right of the building was a small alley tucked between the store and a chain-link fence. There was a car parked in front of the alley, but down from it just a bit, which left a small gap that a tiny car could fit through between the car and getting through the narrow alley. I hope that explains the scene okay. As I got out of my car, another car decided to try to fit in between the parked car and into the alley. But it didn't. It scraped up against the car parked in front of the alley and dented the front end and left huge scratch marks. I was pretty shocked. Before I could even get in the store, a man walked out and headed towards the damaged car. I said, "Sir, someone hit your car as it squeezed into the alley." He then yelled, "What?" and a few expletives. I told him I was sorry and that I wasn't able to get the plate number. He then got even madder and started yelling more. At this point, all I wanted to do was get into the store and out of this situation that I brought on myself. But things only got worse. The man then reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. He began to wave it around and scream and yell. He then said, "I'll shoot him. I'll shoot anyone." At this point, I was just flat out terrified and frozen in place. I wasn't sure what to do. Should I make a beeline for the store? Or my car? My fight or flight kicked in, and I decided that surely flight was the better option. As he continued his tirade, I decided to turn around and walk at a brisk pace back towards my car. My muscles tightened as I could only think about a bullet piercing my back or, God forbid, the back of my head. I've never felt more unadulterated dread in my life. I've never had to deal with a maniac with a gun. Finally, after what seemed like a solid 5 minutes, which I'm sure was only about 15 seconds, I was in my car. I let out a huge sigh of relief. I turned my car on and burned out of the parking lot as fast as possible, shaking like a leaf. I thought about calling the police, but then decided against it. I don't know if that was the wrong or right decision, but what I do know is that the right decision now is to mind my own business. I was on a long drive trip a while back, heading to another state for a work event that I was pretty much told I needed to be a part of. I was given the options to fly, or to drive a rental car out there, and if I drove, I had to do it over the weekend, and I wouldn't be paid for mileage. Which, whatever. I am terrified of flying, so I chose to drive. There's no particular reason for me to be terrified of flying, but the 2 times that I have been on a plane, I've had full-blown panic attacks that have ended in myself vomiting. I think it's just me. I get freaked out and I panic. So, obviously, I told my boss that I would get a rental car and just drive to the conference. The trip took way longer than I honestly anticipated, and I was driving pretty late into the night. And at the point where this event happened, I was running low on gas. I wasn't low enough that I would have ended up on the side of the highway, at least I don't think so, but I was low enough that I had made plans to fill up at the next station that I saw on an exit sign. I went for a while longer, saw that there was a station at the next exit that indicated it was open 24 hours, and thought that I should consider stopping to use the restroom, getting something to drink, and then fill up my tank. I pulled off, and after a little bit of searching, I did find the station. It was decently lit, so that wasn't a huge deal for me, but as I parked, I noticed that in the same parking lot as the station was what looked like an old motel that was boarded up. It kind of looked like a stereotypical old motel. 2 floors, 3 rooms on each floor, and then the 1 extra room on the bottom that had the word office on the door. A couple of the rooms were missing their doors. Some of them were just boarded up, and some of the windows looked smashed. Honestly, it's not relevant, but it was a bit unsettling. But I wasn't there for lodging, I was there for gas. I headed into the station, and it looked decent at the very least. Like, sure, it was a bit dim, and a couple of the fluorescent bulbs were burned out, but the floor was clean, and everything looked well stocked. It wasn't a small station either. There was actually a good amount of space, and everything looked open, so it was kept up. And there were 2 guys standing at the front counter talking to the clerk, and honestly, none of them looked too threatening. They just looked normal. As I walked in, the clerk turned his attention to me, and he, very politely, asked me if he could help me find anything. I asked him if he had a restroom, and he motioned toward the back. I nodded and headed back and did my business. While I was washing my hands, though, I heard what sounded like all 3 men giggling like schoolchildren. At what, I don't know, but at the same time, people laughing isn't necessarily a bad thing or creepy. It was just something that I noted. When I walked out of the restroom, though, I could literally feel the three of them just staring at me as I went over to the drink cooler to get something for myself and grabbed a snack. I thought that they would look away or break their stares as I walked toward the counter, but nope. They all three just kept watching me as I approached. I tried my best to ignore it as the guy scanned my items, but after a few moments of my skin starting to crawl, as the other two were glaring, I looked over towards them with a stare of, "All right, I know you're staring, you can stop now." As soon as my attention was turned toward them, one of the guys took this opportunity to say, "We were making a bet on something, and I wanted to know, what would you rate me out of 10? This caught me a bit off guard, and I wasn't really sure what to say. I just kind of scoffed and turned back toward the clerk. Unfortunately, he was in on their game, and he was just staring at me with his eyes wide holding my Red Bull. At this point, I was annoyed, so I just said that I would like to pay for my stuff and go. He then told me that he would give me my things when I answered the question. I said that I wasn't interested in whatever this was, and that I would just like to pay and go. Once again, he laughed and said, "Not until you answer him." At this point, I decided that it wasn't worth my time to put up with this, and there were three of them versus one of me. I turned and walked away from them, but as soon as I reached the door, I felt a hand reach out and grab my hip. Unfortunately for the person that grabbed me, which was the man that had asked me to rate him out of 10, as I was walking towards the door, I had actually unhooked my pepper spray from my keys. I had a small cartridge that had a keyring on it, and he took the full blast of it to the face. The other two men started yelling at me, he started screaming, and I turned and took off towards my car. Thankfully, the car had a push start, so I was able to get the engine going and get out on the road before the three of them could even get out into the parking lot. The whole time I was pulling away and getting back on the highway, I was staring back at my rear view and seeing if they were following me, which, thankfully, they weren't. After about 5 minutes of being back on the highway, I pulled over and resituated myself, trying to calm down and get through the anxiety attack that it was definitely about to hit me. In the end, I was just thankful that I had the mental wherewithal to grab my pepper spray while I was walking. I just had that feeling that one of them was going to try something. I ended up going for about another half an hour until I found a gas station in a much less creepy and more populated area, and I filled up without issue. This was definitely the event that made it click that these things can happen to me, and I'm way more aware of my surroundings now. Before the guys started in on being a creep, I really didn't get any red flags from them, but even those that don't seem like creeps can be the worst. I'm not saying be paranoid or be scared of everyone, just that being prepared is always a good idea. So, that, my friends, was a collection of scary gas station horror stories, terrifying stories that occur at gas stations. Gas stations are, for some reason completely unknown to me, magnets for the creepy things that happen in this world. I swear, between these stories that I've read, stories that I've heard people like Southern Canny read, I don't understand how so much terrifying activity occurs at a place where you're just supposed to fill up your gas tank and, buy taquitos. Or what are they called, I guess? What was Derringer? What did they say they were? Twisters where he is? Anyways, the little roll-up things filled with meat and cheese that are probably what causes my cholesterol to be elevated, even though I haven't eaten one in like a year. Um, guarantee you it's those. But anyways, my point is, why do gas stations attract creepiness? Is it just the 24-hour aspect of it? If so, I guess you would think that Walmart would too, and I mean, there's quite a few stories like that out there too, so maybe that's what it is, guys. Maybe we've cracked the code. Maybe the later an establishment is open, the more creepiness it attracts. In that case, I'm going to spend all my time at breakfast and brunch places, because they close at like 2. Anyways, hope you all enjoyed the stories. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard and want more like this, hit that subscribe button. If you're feeling so bold, you can leave me a comment down below telling me how you're doing. If you've ever had a creepy encounter at a gas station or a convenience store, anything like that, I'd love to read it. You can also send me a story, as I mentioned at the beginning, as theravendreams.com. There's a big button that says submit your story. You can also join the Patreon or hit the join button down below, where you get early access to content like this. As long as I'm ahead, which I'm ahead for this one. Yay, Raven. So some people are going to hear this before others. That's kind of cool. Good job. I appreciate them. All of this is, of course, always appreciated and never expected. So, just, if you don't want to do any of that, that's fine. You listened to the video or watched the video to this point, and that means the world to me. So, thank you. And, of course, until friends, I see you again. Remember that you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you're the best you that you can be. Never let anybody tell you otherwise. And until I see you again, much love, and sleep well.